Hello everyone. So we come to the sixth part of the video series, and here we are going to discuss about the functions in Python. And simply, I assume that you know what's a function. So if you can't remember what's a function, simply a function is a set of organized set of instructions or set of codes, right? And that can be identified as a reusable set of codes. Now, what we can do is we can include a set of codes or set of instructions, and we can define it as a function. So what's the advantage of defining a set of code as a or block of codes as a function? That it gives us the ability of reuse, right? So once a function is declared, we can reuse the function, and we can call that function anytime we want. So no need to run the code segment again and again. We can use the same code and get the output multiple times using the same function by calling that function. So that's what you call a function. So a set of instructions or set of reusable set of codes or reusable set of instructions, simply we can identify as a function, right? So in Python, when you are going to define functions, this is how simply the syntax of a function can be identified. There is a keyword that you have to always include when you are going to define a function. That is the def keyword, right? So no matter what's the function that you are going to implement, always that should start with the keyword def. So def keyword always should be there before starting a function, right? So def is the keyword simply that you are going to use when you are defining a function, right? So all the functions, def will be the first keyword, and then you can have the function name. So function name can be anything. You can have your own function name, right? You can give any name as you like, and then within parentheses you have the set of parameters, right? You have a set of parameters. You can give the parameter list or the argument list inside the parentheses. So simply, this is what you call a function, and simply this is the function definition. This is how you are going to define the function, right? So the function definition is always like this. Once a function is defined, now you know a function is a set of reusable codes. So once a function is defined, you can call it, right? So this is the function definition, and this is what you call the function call. So how we are going to call the function? You have to call it by the name, and then you have to pass parameters and call the function like this. But parameter passing is optional. I mean, parameterized function is optional. I mean, that's not always it's not required to implement functions with parameters. Sometimes functions are there without parameters, right? But we, as a standard, we define parameters like this, right? So for example, here you have a function that we have started it using the def keyword, and then the function name and the set of parameters. So we have 3 parameters included here. And as I mentioned, so this is a block. Function is also a block. So how we are going to start a block is with the colon, right? So with the colon, and by keeping a tab, the tab is automatically kept, as I mentioned in the previous tutorials. We have a set of instructions. So we have a simple set of instructions here. To be exact, we have only 3 instructions here: print A, print B, and print C, right? So this is how we are going to define the function, and this is called the function definition. Once the function is defined, what you can then do, you can call it like this. Now, when you are going to call the function, you have to pass the parameters to the function. For example, now this 10 will be passed here, and this hello will be passed here, and this one will be passed to C, right? So that's how the function simply be called, right? Now, if you run this one, you can see a simple output like this. So it prints A, like we pass 10 to A, so A is 10, and hello to B, and 20.5 to C. Now, in like other programming languages, no need to have the data type. In Python, we don't worry about data type. And also the return type, no, we don't have return type. Instead of the return type, what we implement and what we include here is the def keyword. So no matter what's the return of the function, right, it will be always def. Now, what I told to you or some in other programming languages, let's say C, C++, Java, you are going to, this is how you are going to implement a function simply, right? And right, so you know that it should be int A and this should be string C, I mean string B, right? And float C likewise, right? But in Python, no return type and no data types for given function. So simply this is how we are going to implement a function in Python. So def keyword is the indication of this is a function, right? Okay, so now this is what you call the reusability, right? So you can see that we can pass any parameters and we can call the function again and again. So we have only typed the code once, right? So we have defined the function only once, but we can call it any times we want, any time we want, right? So that's why you call it's a reusable code. So we can change the parameters and we can call it any times we want, right? So that's what we call it as a reusable set of instructions. So now these are the set of instructions, and since it's inside the function, we can reuse it. Reusable set of instructions. Understood? And in Python, when you with respect to the arguments, right? So arguments are these values that you are going to pass, right? So if you take arguments, and in Python we have 4 types of functions, right? When it comes to argument. So argument wise, right, we can divide functions into 4 main types, and those are required arguments, keyword arguments, default arguments, and variable length arguments. So 4 main types of functions available in Python when it comes to arguments, right? So what we will do now, we will go through each and every function type of these 4, and we will discuss how the things are happening in those function types, right? Okay, so this is actually what we have, the early example. We have we have a parameterized function. Now it takes 3 parameters, A, B, and C. The function name is my function. Simply what it does is, this takes these 3 values and it prints those values. So that's what simply the function does. Now here we have a function call. So what happens in similar to the earlier case, right? So 10 will be passed here, and hello is passed to B, and 20.5 is passed to C, right? So the expected output will be something like this, right? So you are getting the output. But what happens here now, if you pass only 2 values, right? So we don't pass 3, but we pass 2. Now what happens here? Okay, when you pass 10, it will be passed to A, it will be passed to A, and we pass hello, it will be passed to B, right? So you don't pass anything to C. So in that case, you are going to end up with an error. It says my function missing 1 required positional argument C, right? So when you define a function like this is called the required argument type, right? So you have A, B, and C parameters to be passed arguments, but when you pass 2, this gives an error since you don't pass anything to C, right? So if you define the function like this is called the required argument type functions. Now, no matter how many arguments are there in the function definition, when you call the function, you have to pass values for each and every argument given in the function definition. Understood, right? So that kind of a thing is there. So that's what you call required argument type. So this is the default. I mean, this is the required argument type, and you can see what's the functionality of this required argument type. No matter how many parameters are there in the function call, you have to pass parameters to each and every parameter given in the function definition, right? So other than that, you are going to end up with an error, right? So no matter when you are going to pass 1 value, the scenario is the same, right? Okay, so this is the issue. Now, if you take the practical example, right? In some cases, like, okay, let's say if you have done a graphical user interface development, I mean PC application development or any other web application development, you have seen that, okay, if you create a button in a GUI, right? Graphical user interface. If you are creating a button, right? In order to create that button, you have to pass the font size, the font color, the background color, the foreground color, the font scale, and the font and the width, height of the button, the color of the button. Likewise, we have to pass around like 20, 30 parameters in order to create a button. But always we don't pass all the values, all the 20, 30 values. Like we use the gray default color, and sometimes we use the default values like the text Times New Roman, right? So we only pass the height and width and the text of the button, right? So always we don't need to have the, we won't pass the parameters, all the parameters, values to all the parameters, right? So you can see in the practical implementation, this is not working, right? So if you have, let's say, 20 parameter function, imagine you have to like remember everything and pass all the 20 values. For example, now when you create a button, sometimes you don't pass the hover color, or you don't pass the background color, you don't pass the height and width. So they are assigned to some default. So if you don't pass the font, sometimes it assigned to the Times New Roman. If you don't pass the background color of the function, it will be assigned to the gray, right? So the second type of functions are like that, default argument functions. So in default argument functions, what you can do is we can provide some default values in the function definition like this, right? So now what I have done here, I have like assigned 0 to A, I have assigned a space to B, right? And let me like provide X in order to understand. Okay, I have assigned a string X to this one, and I have assigned like, let's say, okay, 1000 to C, right? So now what happens? Let me call the my function with 3 parameters. So then no any issues appeared. You can see the usual thing has happened, right? I mean, so 10 will be passed to A, and hello will be passed to B, and 10.2 will be passed to C, right? So everything is done perfectly. But what happens if you pass only 2, right? So in this kind of a situation, what happens? So let me run this and see. Okay, now earlier we ended up with an error, but here we are not getting an error. Instead of that, the C is also printed, but the value of C is simply 1000. That means what happens here? We pass 10, and 10 will be passed to A, and we pass hello, and hello will be passed to B, and we don't pass anything to C. So what happens? We don't get an error. The default value given here in the function definition will be assigned to C. So whenever you are not going to pass any value to any kind of a parameter, right? In that case, the default value will be assigned, right? The default value will be assigned given in the function definition. So that's what you call the default argument function. Now, default argument function, for example, now here in the second instant, we don't pass values to B and C as well. We only pass 10. So 10 will be passed to A, and you can see the value of A is 10, but other 2 parameters, they have assigned the default values. We are not going to get an error. So even in this kind of a case, you can call the function without any parameters as well. But one important thing is there, most commonly and most of the cases, we keep the first or the first and second parameters as required argument types, since most of the function need 1 or 2 parameters to run that function, right? So not all the arguments are default, but some of the arguments can be, the first few arguments can be required and others can be default, right? For example, if you create a button, the button text is not optional, it's mandatory. So text will be a required argument, and color, the hover color, and the background height and width, they can be default, right? Okay, so then yeah, so we discussed about we have to discuss about the keyword argument. So keyword argument is very simple. Now you know that if you pass values like this to a function, right? So now these are passed in order, right? In order in the sense, now this 10 will be passed to the first parameter, and the hello will be passed to the second parameter, and the 10.2 passed to the third parameter C. right? So it's like this one and this one as well as this one, right? So what happens here is simply that you can know now in this kind of a situation, what happens that you have to always remember the order of the parameters, right? So that means you have to keep in your mind, okay, the first value that we are going to pass is passed to A, the second value is passed to B, and the third value is passed to C. Likewise, you have to keep the order in your mind. Now, let's take like a function with, let's say, 20 parameters or 50 parameters sometimes. Then you have to keep those order of the parameter in your mind. Understood? So the thing is, without doing that, what we can do is we can call the function, right? So we can call the function, for example, here, right? So we can call the function by calling the keyword like this, right? If you can't remember the order, you can simply say, okay, pass 10.2, 10.56 to C, and pass like 10, I mean pass 100 to A, and pass hello to B, right? Now the order is not going to be a matter. We call it from the keyword, right? So we call it from the keyword. So C, we pass the first value to C, right? So we call the keyword and pass, not in order. Now this will be passed to A and this will be passed to B likewise. The parameters are not passed in order, but what we'll do here, we simply pass them by calling the keyword. So no need to keep the order of the parameters or the arguments in your mind, right? So that's what you call the keyword arguments. And the keyword arguments can be always combined with default arguments as well, right? So what you can do now, here we have default 0 and let's say 1000 here, right? So we can combine default arguments and keyword arguments. Now what happens? We pass 100 to B and we pass 90 to A, and we don't pass anything to C, right? So C becomes the default value simply here, right? Understood? Okay, so this is what you call the keyword argument type functions, right? And finally, what we have is we have a function type called variable length argument. So I will take an example and explain you what's a variable length argument. So let me define a function called my function, right? My function, and let me add the two parameters like A and B, right? And let me print A and B and show you the output, right? Right, so let me run the code, and now the function is defined here. So let me call it using few sample values like, okay, 10 and 20 I'm going to pass, right? Okay, so now you can see A is like 20, and 20 is something that you are familiar. This is a tuple, but tuple with one value, right? So round brackets is a tuple, so tuple with one values. So what's the specialty? Now if you put a star here, that becomes a variable length argument, right? So that becomes a variable length argument. So that's called a variable length argument, and this is a normal argument, but this is a variable length argument. What do you mean by a variable length argument? That a variable length argument can take any number of parameters. Now always, now we know that 10 will be passed to A, right? And 20 passed to B. But now let's see what happens if we pass some multiple values like this. Now this kind of a situation, what will happen actually, that if this is a normal function like this, it should give error. Like let's say if it was AB, right? This gives an error. It says my function takes only 2 parameters, but you have given 13, right? But here, if you put star here, no errors given, the output will be something like this, right? So what you can see here, the first value, okay, obvious, it will be taken to A, right? And all the other values without giving an error, those values are taken to B, and B is now a tuple. So B converts to a tuple, and it's called a variable length argument, and it takes any number of values you can I mean, you are going to pass. So you can pass any number of values, no any restriction, 1000, 1000, 2000, right? 10,000, any number of values. So those values will be taken to B, and B becomes a tuple and store all the values, right? So can you imagine the usage of this kind of a function, right? So we can use this kind of a variable length argument like this. Okay, let me define a function called find average, right? Find average, right? And I take here a variable length argument called values, let's say, right? Values, and then I print those values to check whether this is working, right? So, okay, find average, and if you pass some sample values and see whether this is working first, then we can implement a application. Okay, so it takes it perfectly, right? So now we can use this kind of function. No matter how many values that we are going to pass, we can measure the average. I mean, this is a example. This is not the only application, but this is an example application, right? So how we are going to do? You know, we have like functions like sum in order to get the sum. So we can get the sum of the values, and we can what? We can divide it by the number of elements. So that's what you call the average, right? Summation divided by the number of elements. So length of values. So we know these things, and we did this on last tutorials, right? So average is calculated, and you can print the average like this. All right. Okay. So let me pass this and run this like this. So you can see the average can be calculated simply like this. So let us pass some other parameters as well and see what happens here. See, so it's correctly giving you the average. And so that's what you call the variable length argument. So what it means, you can pass any number of values, no any restriction. So you can have even one variable length, and you can pass any number of parameters, and then you can get the average like this, right? Okay, so then we are going to discuss about the return statement of the function, right? So you know, in most of the other programming languages, you can return only one value from a function, right? You can return only one value from a function when it comes to other programming languages. But in Python, Python functions can return any number of values as you want, right? You can return any number of values. So in other programming languages, one, but in Python, unlimited values can be returned from a Python function, right? So we have example. Here we say we have a function called add, and it takes two values, two arguments to arg1 and arg2. So we can calculate the total, and we return the total. So what happens simply, so this is the function definition, you know, right? The function definition. So in the function definition, what you can see is that we have two arguments to be taken, and addition and then return. So once a return is given, that return will be passed to the function call, right? So the return will be passed to the function call always, right? So the function call is here. We call the function, and we pass two parameters 10 and 20, and those will be taken to two arguments and get the total, and the return the total, and the return will be taken this value, right? So there should be always a value in the function call to take the return if there's a return. Optional, sometimes if there's a return, it's not necessary to have a value in the function call, but if there is a value in the function call, the return can be taken into that value, right? Okay, and the other thing is that when it comes to Python functions, right? Python functions can return multiple values, not only single value, right? So for example, we have a function called calculator here, which takes two parameters like value 1 and value 2, def calculator value 1 and value 2. And here you can see we pass 10 and 2 here. And so 10 and 2 will be passed to value 1 as well as value 2, right? So what we have done here, we have taken the addition, right? We have taken the subtraction, we have taken the multiplication and division. So we have calculated everything, and we return simply everything here. Not only one value, you can see we return addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So we return 4 values here. So this is not a common thing in other programming languages. This is a special case find in Python, right? So now if we take that value to this one called value, right? So what you will see when you run the function, so value will be value consists of those 4 values. And the thing is that can you see it's taken into a tuple, right? So tuple in the sense you can't change these values again, right? So function return given as a tuple, since it's like no need to change, right? No needed to be like, it should be protected. So that's why it's giving in a tuple. So if you take to a one value, I mean one object or a one variable, it will be assign it as a tuple, right? So if you return multiple values, if you take it to a one variable like this, so it becomes a tuple, and you can see the tuple with the return values. And also the other option is you can do the same, but you can take the return into single elements like this. So if you can, if it returns 4 values, what you can do is you can have 4 elements here, and you can take the values separately, right? So now everything that we are going to learn in this set of tutorials will be used in our advanced workshops, right? The coming workshops. So keep that thing in mind, and please go through these materials again and try to implement these yourselves and change these things and see the outputs, what happens, and how these things behave, right? Okay, so one last thing when it comes to function called the anonymous function. So anonymous function is a very important idea, and not used in not used commonly, but a very useful idea. So lambda function is simply a very simple function available in Python. And if you have a very simple function and a very small function with like a one-line function, you can implement it as a lambda function, right? So this is how we are going to implement a lambda function. So lambda function, you have to have the lambda keyword, right? Lambda keyword, and then you have to pass you have to declare the parameters. So these are the two. This means like this function has 2 parameters, right? And colon. Thereafter, you have to have the return, right? So if you go to the definition, these functions are called anonymous because they are not declared in the standard manner by using the def keyword, right? So that's why it's called lambda or anonymous function. You can use the lambda keyword to create a small anonymous function. So we have several points. We will go through each and every. Lambda forms can take number of arguments, but any number of arguments, but return only one value. So it can take any number of arguments, 10 arguments, 4 arguments, 4 parameters, 10 inputs, any number of inputs, right? But it can return only one value, and it also can be returned in the form of an expression. So you have to return it as expression, right? And it says specifically they cannot contain commands or multiple expressions, right? Understood? So for example, now this takes 2 values as the input, and the return will be just the addition. So only one return, and the return also written in kind of expression form, right? So you have to write it as an equation, right? So here the function name will be my function. So my function equals lambda, and this is the parameters, 2 parameters, and this is the return, right? So simply if we take this function, so what happens here is that this 10 will be passed here and 20 will be passed here, right? And what happens, it adds them up and return it to here, to the value, right? So that's what simply happens, what happens here, right? So if we I have called that function like 10 20 and 20 20, and so you can see it simply gives you the output. And you have another example here, my function equal lambda. So we have 3 arguments, and we take 3 values as input, that means, and the return is simply the argument 1 plus argument 2 into argument 3. So that's, I want to highlight here that you need to return the value as the expression in terms of the input arguments, right? So here we pass like 2, 3, and 2, and then the value will be simply 2 into 3 is 6, 2 plus 3 is 5, into 2 is 10, right? Understood? Okay, so that's what you call lambda function simply. Okay, so actually that's what I want to discuss under functions. And so thank you very much, and we will meet on the next video.